In the harsh winter of 1875, Sarah Winters stands alone in her buried schoolhouse, watching as the merciless Montana blizzard claims everything she owns. Fresh grief from her husband's passing mingles with the bitter cold as she realizes she might not survive the night. The howling wind drowns out her prayers, and frost creeps across the windows like death's own fingers. But fate has other plans. Through the whiteout appears a figure on horseback, James Crawford, the mysterious frontiersman whose vast lands and solitary nature have sparked countless tales across the territory. What secrets lie behind the walls of his isolated cabin, and can two broken souls find healing in each other's company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Earlier that fateful day, Sarah's weathered fingers traced the leather binding of her teaching journal, its pages crisp with lesson plans and margin notes collected over 5 years of instruction. The morning light, wan and grey through gathering. Clouds barely illuminated the classroom's rough-hewn walls. Young Tommy Henderson, usually the most spirited of her 20 pupils, had fallen unusually quiet at his desk, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the windows where snow was beginning to swirl. "Perhaps we should conclude early today," Sarah murmured, more to herself than the remaining students. The words felt like surrender in her mouth. In all her years of teaching, first in Boston's crowded schoolrooms and now here in Montana territory, she had never dismissed class before the appointed hour. Thomas, her late husband, had always admired her steadfast dedication. Punctuality and persistence, he would say, are the cornerstones of character. The memory of his voice, still sharp despite the 6 months since his passing, caused her throat to tighten. She pulled the shawl closer around her shoulders, its wool offering little comfort against the growing chill. Most parents had already collected their children as the storm warnings spread through town, but 5 students remained, their faces pinched with concern. "Miss Julia," she called to the oldest girl, "please help the younger ones gather their things." The 13-year-old nodded, her natural leadership emerging as she assisted the smaller children with buttons and scarves. Sarah watched them, thinking how Julia had grown since that first day she'd arrived at the schoolhouse, shy and uncertain after her family's long journey west. Through the fogging windows, Sarah could see Mrs. Peterson approaching, her sturdy form leaning into the strengthening wind. "Tommy, Emily, your mother's here," Sarah announced, relief coloring her voice. The siblings scrambled to collect their books, their boots clumping heavily on the wooden floor. At the door, Mrs. Peterson's weather-worn face creased with worry. "Mrs. Winters, you shouldn't stay here alone. The storm's building faster than anyone expected. My Robert says it's the worst he's seen coming this early in the season." Sarah forced a smile she didn't feel. "I'll be fine, Mrs. Peterson. James and Catherine's father should be along shortly." She gestured to the remaining children, the youngest of whom was already fighting tears. "We'll keep warm until then." But as the hours crept by and the light diminished, no other parents appeared. The wind's howl grew louder, and dark thoughts began to crowd Sarah's mind. Her small woodpile wouldn't last the night if the storm continued, and the school's thin walls were never meant to withstand such bitter cold. She thought of her own small cabin, a 1/4 mile's walk away, but knew attempting the journey with 2 young children would be madness in the growing whiteout. Catherine began to cry softly, and James pulled his sister close, trying to be brave, despite his own trembling lip. Sarah gathered them near the stove, wrapping her spare shawl around their shoulders. "Shall I tell you about the time I taught school in Boston?" she began, forcing cheer into her voice. "We had a visitor one day, a famous poet who read to us about birds and flowers." But as she spoke, her eyes kept straying to the windows, now almost completely obscured by driving snow. The last grey light was fading, and with it, Sarah felt her hope diminishing as well. She reached for her journal again, its familiar texture anchoring her to reality as the storm raged beyond the walls. In its pages, between carefully penned multiplication tables and grammar exercises, lay the preserved flower Thomas had given her on their last spring together. The petals, once vibrant blue, had faded to a delicate lavender. She thought of him then, of his steady hands building this schoolhouse, of his dreams for their future in this wild territory. "Watch over us," she whispered, though whether to Thomas's memory or to God she wasn't certain. The children had grown quiet, huddled together in the growing darkness. Sarah struck a match with trembling fingers, lighting the last of their candles. The flame's weak glow caught the frozen patterns growing on the window panes, transforming them into ghostly gardens of ice. She knew then, with growing certainty, that they were truly trapped, their fate now at the mercy of the merciless Montana winter. The brass school bell hung silent above them, its rope swaying gently in drafts that shouldn't exist. Sarah had rung it 3 times already, hoping its clear voice would carry through the storm to whoever might be searching for James and Catherine. But each time, the wind had torn away its call, scattering the sound into the whiteout beyond. "Miss Winters," Catherine's voice quavered in the candlelight, "tell us about Mr. Crawford again." The girl huddled closer to her brother, their shared blanket pulled tight. "Father says his house has glass windows from back east." Sarah settled beside them, conserving the candle's precious light. She'd heard the stories too. Everybody had. James Crawford owned half the territory's timberland, though few had ever seen him. Some said he'd made his fortune in railroad stocks. Others whispered about gold strikes in California. What was known was that he lived alone in a grand house, somewhere in the hills, appearing in town only to conduct business. "They say his library has more books than the one in Helena," James added, his young voice warming to the distraction. "And Mary Beth told me he has a real piano, though nobody ever plays it." Sarah smiled, despite their dire situation. Trust children to find wonder in mystery. She remembered the first time she'd heard of Crawford, barely a week after arriving. In Montana, Thomas had been finishing the schoolhouse roof, and she'd been unpacking books when Mrs. Peterson brought news of the land baron's latest acquisition. "A man apart," Thomas had said later that evening, "came out here 5 years ago, with more money than God, and grief enough to fill the territory." He never elaborated on that grief, and Sarah hadn't pressed. The West was full of such stories, lives broken and remade in these vast spaces. The candle guttered, casting strange shadows. Catherine had dozed off against her brother's shoulder, but James remained alert, his eyes reflecting the tiny flame. "Father says Mr. Crawford's house never wants for anything," he whispered, "even in the worst winters." Sarah checked their own dwindling supplies. The stove's heat was fading, and they had barely enough wood for another hour. Outside, the storm's voice had changed, becoming deeper, more threatening. The windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the darkness, something cracked. A tree branch, perhaps, or something worse. She thought of her own small cabin, probably already half buried in snow. After Thomas died, she'd stayed on only because of the children, because this schoolhouse represented everything they'd dreamed of building together. Now, watching the frost creep across the floorboards, she wondered if she'd been foolish to remain alone. Catherine stirred in her sleep, whimpering. When Sarah touched her forehead, the skin felt too warm. James looked up, fear finally breaking through his brave facade. "She gets sick easy," he said. "Ever since Mother died." The words hung in the frigid air. Sarah pulled the children closer, sharing what warmth she could. Beyond the walls, the storm howled its ancient song of isolation and despair. She thought of James Crawford in his fine house with its glass windows and unplayed piano. What kind of man accumulated such wealth only to live in solitude? What grief could drive someone to build a fortress against the world? The candle sputtered, threatening to die. In its last light, Sarah saw frost patterns growing across the window panes like skeletal fingers reaching inward. The brass bell above them creaked on its mounting, and in that sound she heard all her hopes of rescue fading into the gathering dark. "We'll be all right," she whispered, but the words felt hollow in the deepening cold. The storm had them now, and all the stories of wealthy recluses and grand houses couldn't change that simple, brutal fact. As the last light failed, Sarah pulled the children closer and began to pray. Not for herself, but for these two innocent souls entrusted to her. Care on this terrible night. Sarah's fingers trembled as she unwound the hand-knitted scarf from her neck, Thomas's last Christmas gift to her. The wool still held his scent, or perhaps that was just her imagination desperately clinging to memory. Either way, she couldn't let Catherine shiver while this small comfort remained. As she wrapped the scarf around the feverish child, Sarah whispered the same prayer her husband had taught her for difficult times. "The Lord is my shepherd." The girl's skin burned despite the room's penetrating cold. James had finally succumbed to exhaustion beside his sister, their breath forming small clouds in the darkness. The last candle had died an hour ago, leaving only the faint, blue-white gleam of snowlight filtering through the frosted windows. "I shall not want," Sarah continued, though want surrounded them. They wanted for heat, for light, for rescue. The stove had gone cold, their final piece of wood nothing but ash and dying embers. She'd already burned her lesson books and the kindling she'd stored for winter, but it hadn't been enough. Nothing was enough against this kind of cold. Sarah tucked Thomas's scarf more securely around Catherine's neck, remembering how he'd knitted it during long evening hours last winter. "You'll need something warm," he'd said, his eyes already holding the shadow of the illness that would take him in spring. Montana winters show no mercy to gentle souls. He'd been right about that. The territory's beauty had drawn them west, its soaring mountains and endless skies promising adventure and possibility, but its dangers were equally vast. Thomas had understood that better than she, having grown up in Minnesota's harsh climate. He'd tried to prepare her, teaching her to split wood and bank fires, to read weather signs and store provisions. A violent gust rattled the schoolhouse, and Sarah felt new drafts cutting through her dress. Somewhere in the walls, timber groaned. Ominously, Catherine moaned in her sleep, and Sarah pressed her palm against the child's forehead, alarmed at the heat she felt there. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," she whispered, but the words caught in her throat. Summer's green pastures felt like a distant dream now. Even her memories of Thomas were becoming harder to grasp, as if the cold were freezing them away, crystal by crystal. The first signs of frostbite had appeared on her fingers, angry red, patches warning of worse to come. She tucked her hands under her arms, knowing she should keep moving, but lacking the strength. The children's faces had taken on a frightening pallor, their cheeks touched with the same telltale redness. "He leadeth me beside the still waters." Sarah's voice cracked. No still waters here, only the storm's relentless fury. She thought of her journey west, of Thomas's quiet confidence as they'd faced each new challenge. "You have pioneer spirit," he told her. But what good was spirit against nature's raw power? The windows had nearly frosted over completely now, transforming the schoolhouse into a tomb of ice. Sarah forced herself to stand, to stamp her feet, to fight against the seductive pull of sleep that accompanied deep cold. Thomas had warned her about that too, how freezing was a quiet death, promising peace but delivering only oblivion. "He restoreth my soul." The words emerged as vapor in the darkness. Catherine's breathing had grown labored, and James shivered violently in his sleep. Sarah gathered them closer, sharing what little warmth remained in her body. She thought of Mrs. Peterson's warning, of Thomas's lessons about survival, of James. Crawford's mysterious fortress somewhere in these mountains, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." The prayer fell from numb lips as Sarah watched frost patterns claim more of the windows. Each breath was an effort now, the cold air burning in her lungs. She wrapped Thomas's scarf more tightly around Catherine's neck, remembering her husband's patient hands working the needles, loop by loop, row by row, crafting this last gift of protection. I will fear no evil. But fear was all she had left. As the storm howled its triumph and the darkness deepened around them, the first sign of salvation came as a shadow, darker than darkness itself, moving across the frosted windows. Sarah might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been staring at that exact spot, watching ice crystals form in the depths of her despair. The shape passed again, more deliberate this time, and something heavy struck the schoolhouse door. "Hello?" Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, her throat too cold to manage more. The children stirred fitfully but didn't wake. The pounding came again, and with it, a sound that might have been a voice calling through the storm. Sarah tried to stand, but found her legs unwilling to cooperate. The door shuddered in its frame, ice cracking around its edges. Then, with a blast of wind and swirling snow, it burst open, revealing a towering figure wrapped in furs. The man's beard was crusted with ice, his eyes dark beneath a snow-laden hat brim. A worn leather saddlebag hung at his side, and his movements, as he stepped into the room, spoke of careful deliberation. This was someone used to measuring each action, someone who understood the weight of consequences. "James Crawford," he said simply, his voice deep but gentle, like distant thunder. His gaze took in the scene, the cold stove, the huddled children, Sarah's desperate attempt at dignity, even in extremis. Something flickered in those eyes, something that might have been recognition or memory. "The children," Sarah managed to say. "Catherine has fever." Crawford moved with surprising grace for such a large man. He knelt beside the siblings, one gloved hand touching Catherine's forehead. From his saddlebag came a flask, then a small tin of what proved to be peppermint salve. "For her breathing," he explained, applying it beneath the girl's nose. "My wife." He stopped, as if the words had frozen in his throat, then continued more softly. "My late wife was a healer." The revelation hung in the air between them, so this was part of his mystery, a loss that mirrored her own. Sarah watched as he tended to the children with practiced care, his huge hands surprisingly gentle. When he offered her the flask, the brandy inside burned life back into her frozen throat. "My horse can carry the girl," he said, rewrapping Catherine in Thomas's scarf and adding his own outer coat. "The boy can ride behind me. You'll have to walk, but I'll break trail." He spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to solving problems, to taking responsibility for others' lives. "The storm," Sarah began, but Crawford shook his head. "Will get worse before it gets better. We have maybe an hour before. Full dark, and my cabin is the closest shelter." He lifted Catherine as if she weighed nothing, then turned those dark eyes on Sarah again. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. As if reading her doubt, Crawford produced a pair of worn wool mittens from his saddlebag. "Put these on. Your hands are already showing frost." The mittens, when she pulled them on, carried the same faint scent of peppermint as the salve. Outside, the storm was a living thing, all howling fury and stinging ice. Crawford's horse, a massive black stallion, stood patiently in the shelter of the schoolhouse wall, steam rising from its flanks. With careful efficiency, Crawford secured Catherine in front of the saddle, then helped James mount behind. The boy's face showed equal parts fear and awe as he gripped the back of Crawford's heavy coat. "Stay close," Crawford instructed Sarah, taking up the horse's reins. "Step where I step. If you fall behind, call out. Don't try to be brave." Something in his tone suggested he'd learned this lesson the hard way. They set out into the white chaos, Crawford breaking trail as promised, his broad shoulders parting the snow like a ship's prow through heavy seas. Sarah focused on his boots, putting her feet in each depression he left. The wind tried to steal her breath, but the mittens kept her hands warm enough to maintain feeling. Through the swirling snow, she caught glimpses of Crawford's face as he turned to check on her. Each time, his expression held the same mix of concern and determination. Here was a man used to battling nature, to bending circumstances to his will. Yet there was something else in those backward glances, a haunted quality that matched the grief she'd heard in his voice when he mentioned his wife. "Not far now," he called over the wind's roar, though Sarah could see nothing but white in every direction. She stumbled, and his hand shot out to steady her, strong as iron through the thick gloves. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Sarah saw past the frost and fur to something that made her heart catch. Not handsome exactly, but compelling. A face carved by solitude and marked by some great sorrow, yet not defeated by either. Crawford's cabin emerged from the whiteout like a dream, far larger than Sarah had expected, its solid timber walls and steep-pitched roof speaking of careful craftsmanship. Warm light spilled from windows that were, indeed, real glass from back east, and smoke rose straight and strong from two stone chimneys despite the wind. Inside, the contrast with their frozen ordeal was almost overwhelming. Heat from a massive stone fireplace struck Sarah's cold face like a physical blow, and the sense of wood smoke, leather, and something cooking made her dizzy with relief. Crawford carried Catherine straight to a bed in an alcove, efficiently, stripping away wet clothes and wrapping her in thick quilts. "There's an antique chest in the corner," he directed Sarah, his voice steady. "Blue quilt on top. We'll need it." The chest he indicated was a magnificent piece of furniture, clearly brought at great expense from some eastern parlour. Sarah lifted its heavy lid, releasing the scent of cedar and lavender. As she drew out the quilt, her eyes caught on something else within. A daguerreotype in a silver frame, showing a woman with kind eyes and an apothecary's collection of bottles behind her. Crawford's wife, surely. Sarah closed the lid quietly, respecting the privacy of his past. "She's still too warm," Crawford said, his large hand gentle on Catherine's forehead. From a cabinet he retrieved bottles that could have come straight from the daguerreotype, tinctures and tonics with handwritten labels. "My Elizabeth," he said softly, measuring drops into a cup. "She taught me which medicines to keep, how to use them. Said no one should suffer if knowledge could prevent it." The name hung in the air between them. Sarah helped James out of his wet clothes, settling him near the fire with a cup of hot tea that Crawford somehow had ready. The boy's eyes were huge as he took in the cabin's interior, the walls lined with books, the promised piano in one corner, maps and scientific instruments, arranged on massive wooden tables. "Your wife," Sarah ventured carefully. "She was a doctor." Crawford's hands stilled momentarily on the medicine bottles. "Not officially. No college would train a woman then, but she learned from her father, and she had a gift." He administered the medicine to Catherine with practiced ease. The frontier needed healing more than it needed degrees. Sarah saw how his cabin reflected that healing mission. Herbs dried in bunches from the rafters, shelves of medical texts mixed among the other books, clean bandages stored alongside fine linens. This was no mere bachelor's retreat, but a sanctuary, designed for service, even if its master now lived in solitude. "Rest," Crawford told them, his voice brooking no argument. "There's stew keeping warm, but sleep first." He moved about the cabin with the quiet efficiency of long habit, banking fires, closing shutters against the storm that still raged beyond the walls. Sarah found herself fighting to stay awake, the cabin's warmth seeping into her bones, replacing ice with exhausted relief. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Crawford settling into a chair between the children's beds, a medical text open on his lap, his face softened by firelight into something younger, almost vulnerable. She dreamed of Thomas, but for the first time since his death, the dreams held no anguish. He was simply there, smiling, helping her hang herbs to dry in a sunny kitchen. When she turned, it was Crawford's kitchen she stood in, and Thomas was nodding as if in approval or blessing. The dream shifted, and she caught a glimpse of another woman, Elizabeth, arranging bottles on shelves, her movements sure and purposeful. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah felt rather than heard the message, knowledge given in love was never truly lost. Healing could work in many ways. Sarah woke briefly in the night to find Crawford still at his post, his head bent over the book, one hand resting protectively near Catherine's smaller one. The fire had burned low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see his lips moving slightly as he read, as if committing each word to memory was an act of devotion to both the present and the past. Dawn arrived as a gradual brightening behind frost-covered windows. The storm having spent its worst fury in the night, Sarah woke to find Catherine's fever finally broken, the girl sleeping peacefully beneath the blue quilt. Crawford had moved to the kitchen, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fireplace as he prepared what smelled like coffee and fresh bread. "You bake," Sarah said, the simple observation carrying a weight of surprise that made Crawford's lips twitch slightly. Elizabeth insisted everyone should know how to feed themselves properly. He placed a steaming cup before her, said it was as important as any medicine. His hand lingered briefly on the worn map spread across the table, a detailed survey of his lands, marked with notations in two distinct hands. Sarah recognized the territory around her schoolhouse, now just a small dot in a vast expanse of Crawford holdings. "You've built something remarkable here," she said, studying the carefully drawn boundaries and notes about timber stands, water sources, and grazing lands. Built it with her. Crawford's voice held an echo of old pain, but also something else, pride. Perhaps, or purpose. Elizabeth had vision, saw what this land could become, how it could serve the community growing around it. He traced a line on the map with one calloused finger, had plans for a proper hospital here, schools there, places of learning and healing, but she never saw them completed. Sarah kept her voice gentle, offering space for either speech or silence. Fever. Took her 3 years ago, same kind Catherine was fighting. He poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate. After, well, the work remained, even if the dream felt hollow. Sarah thought of her own struggles after Thomas, how the schoolhouse had become both refuge and purpose, sometimes carrying on as its own kind of tribute. Crawford's eyes met hers, holding a flash of recognition. "Your husband? He built that schoolhouse? Every beam and board." Sarah smiled at the memory. Said education was the future of the frontier. That and medicine. He would have admired Elizabeth's vision. They sat in comfortable silence, the map between them like a shared history. James stirred in his bed by the fire, and Crawford rose smoothly to check on him. Sarah watched as this supposedly fearsome recluse tenderly felt the boy's forehead, adjusted his blankets with practiced care. "They'll need to stay at least another day," he said, returning to the table. "The storm's still heavy, and Catherine, you should rest." He hesitated, then added, "There's space enough if you're willing to stay as well." The offer held no pressure, just simple practicality, yet Sarah felt something shift in the air between them. "I would appreciate that," she said carefully, "though I don't wish to impose. No imposition." Crawford began laying out breakfast things with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Elizabeth would have... He stopped, then tried again. "The house has been too empty." Sarah rose to help him, their movements falling into an easy rhythm as they prepared the morning meal. When Catherine woke, alert and hungry for the first time since the fever took hold, Crawford's smile transformed his entire face. It was like watching winter thaw into spring, subtle but profound. Over breakfast, he surprised them all by asking James about his studies, showing genuine interest in the boy's stumbling explanation of arithmetic and geography. Sarah found herself drawing parallels between Crawford's gentle questioning and Elizabeth's teaching methods she must have used in her healing work. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked later, as they watched the children dozing by the fire. "Having people to care for?" Crawford was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the flames. "Didn't realize how much until now," he finally admitted. And in his voice, Sarah heard the first real thaw of his long winter of solitude. The discovery came naturally, as Sarah helped Crawford organize his medical supplies that afternoon. A leather-bound volume of Wordsworth had fallen behind the herb cabinet, and when she retrieved it, The pages fell open to pressed wildflowers, and margin notes in a delicate hand. Elizabeth's favourite, Crawford said quietly, taking the book with reverent care. She marked the passages that spoke of nature's healing power. His fingers traced the faded ink. I've read them so many times, I know them by heart. Sarah glanced at the wall of books behind him, hundreds of volumes, their spines a rainbow of leather and cloth. Would you share one? Something shifted in Crawford's expression, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He turned to a dog-eared page and began to read, "The best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love." His voice, rich and deep, gave the familiar words new meaning. Sarah found herself drawn, not just to the poetry, but to the man revealing himself through another's verses. When he finished, the silence held a different quality than his usual reserve. "Thomas loved Wordsworth too," she offered. "He used to quote the Prelude while working on the schoolhouse, said building something meaningful was its own kind of poetry." Crawford's eyes met hers with sudden understanding. Elizabeth said similar things about healing. That each person helped was a verse in a larger poem. He moved to the shelves, pulling down another volume. She kept a collection of medical poetry, doctors and nurses who wrote about their work. Together, they explored the library, discovering, shared favorites and new treasures. Crawford knew his collection intimately, could find any reference without hesitation. Yet it was clear many volumes hadn't been touched since Elizabeth's passing, as if he'd been waiting for someone to share them with again. The children, feeling better, watched their literary exploration with growing interest. Catherine, particularly, perked up when Crawford mentioned a shelf of children's books collected for the school Elizabeth had hoped to establish. "Perhaps," he said hesitantly, looking at Sarah, "some could be borrowed for your classroom when the weather allows." The suggestion held more than simple generosity. It was an opening, a bridge between his solitary world and hers. "That would be wonderful," she replied, understanding the gift's true value. "Books are windows to larger worlds." Elizabeth used to say that too. Crawford pulled out an illustrated volume of natural history. She believed education and healing went hand in hand. That understanding the world helped people face its challenges. Sarah watched as he showed the book to Catherine, explaining the detailed drawings of plants and animals. His knowledge was deep and careful, clearly built over years of study. This was no mere collector of books, but a true scholar, hidden away in his mountain fortress. "You've read them all?" she asked later, after the children had fallen asleep over their own borrowed volumes. Crawford's smile held a touch of self-deprecation. "Many times over. Winter nights are long here." He paused, then added more softly, "though they're better shared." The implication hung in the air between them, warm as firelight. Sarah found herself imagining winter evenings spent exactly like this, books and conversation, the exchange of ideas and insights, the gradual unfurling of two minds meeting in the realm of words. Thomas always said teaching was about creating connections, she mused, running her fingers along the spines of nearby books, between ideas, between people, between past and future. Elizabeth believed the same about healing. Crawford reached past her for a volume of Keats, his presence solid and warm behind her, that every connection made the world a little more whole. In that moment, surrounded by books that held both their pasts and perhaps their future, Sarah felt something shift in her heart. Here was a man who understood the power of words to bridge solitudes, to heal wounds, to build new possibilities from old sorrows. When Crawford began to read again, his voice low and intimate in the firelit library, she closed her eyes and let the poetry wash over her like a benediction, like a promise, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. That evening, Crawford discovered his father's pocket watch had stopped, frozen in their desperate ride through the storm. He held the silver timepiece in his palm, studying, its silent face with an expression that spoke of more than just broken machinery. "Strange how time changes when you're shut away from the world," he mused, attempting to wind the mechanism. These past days have felt both endless and too brief. Sarah understood exactly what he meant. Outside, the storm continued its siege, but within the cabin's walls, time had taken on a different quality. Each hour seemed to hold more meaning, more weight than those that had preceded their rescue. Elizabeth gave me this watch, Crawford continued, his voice soft with memory. Said a healer needed to track the hours, to know when to give medicines, when to check on patients. His thumb traced the intricate engravings on the case. Haven't used it much since there was no one left to heal. Until now. Sarah offered gently, watching Catherine and James play quietly with a set of carved wooden animals they'd discovered. The children's color had returned, their eyes bright with restored health. Crawford's expression shifted, something like wonder crossing his features. Yes, he agreed. Until now. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind and the children's whispered game. The broken watch lay between them on the table, like a bridge between past and present. Thomas kept precise time, too, Sarah found herself saying. Said a teacher needed to be reliable, to show students that every moment of learning mattered. She smiled at the memory. He'd ring the school bell exactly on the hour, no matter what chaos was happening inside. The bell I heard that night, Crawford said. Through the storm. It led me to you. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I almost didn't ride out. Then I remembered Elizabeth saying no one should face a storm alone. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah thought of all the storms they'd both weathered. In solitude, grief, loneliness, the weight of carrying on when dreams seemed frozen. Sometimes, she said carefully, we need to be reminded that help can come from unexpected places. Crawford nodded, still holding the watch. Elizabeth used to say healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about presence, about someone being there in the dark hours. Like you were there for us, Sarah thought but didn't say. Instead, she watched his hands as he opened the watch case, showing her the inscription inside. Time heals all wounds, but love makes the healing worthwhile. Elizabeth's words, she asked. Her father's, actually. He gave her this watch when she began her healing work. Crawford's voice held both sorrow and pride. She lived by those words. Catherine coughed softly from her place by the fire, and Crawford was instantly alert, moving to check on her with that same quiet efficiency Sarah had come to admire. She watched as he felt the girl's forehead, measured her pulse, offered water with gentle encouragement. You haven't forgotten, Sarah said when he returned. The healing work? No, he admitted, though sometimes I wished I could. He picked up the watch again, trying once more to wind it. Easier to let time stop, to close yourself away from need and hurt and loss. But not better, Sarah said softly, thinking of her own temptation to abandon the schoolhouse after Thomas died. Crawford's hands stilled on the watch. No, he agreed, not better. He looked at her then, really looked, and Sarah felt the full weight of his understanding of how they'd both chosen to continue their work despite their losses, how purpose had kept them moving when grief might have frozen them in place. The watch remained silent, but somehow its stillness no longer seemed like an ending. Instead, Sarah thought, it marked a moment of transition, like the pause between the last note of one song and the first breath of another. The chess set caught Sarah's eye that evening, a masterwork of hand-carved pieces arranged on a board of inlaid maple and walnut. Crawford noticed her interest and smiled, the expression warming his weathered features. Elizabeth's father made it, he explained, lifting the white queen with careful fingers. Taught her the game during their long nights of medical study. Later she taught me, saying it helped develop the strategic thinking a healer needs. May I? Sarah asked, drawn to the piece's intricate detail. Crawford nodded, and they set up, the board on a small table near the fire. The children had long since gone to sleep, their steady breathing a gentle counterpoint to the storm's diminishing fury. Thomas tried to teach me once, Sarah admitted, moving a pawn. I'm afraid I wasn't the most patient student. Crawford's answering move was unhurried, considered. Patience comes with understanding the larger pattern. His fingers lingered on the piece, and Sarah found herself watching their careful strength, thinking of how those same hands had tended Catherine's fever, prepared their meals, held firm against the storm. Like teaching, she offered, studying the board, seeing how small lessons build toward greater knowledge or healing. Crawford's voice held a note she hadn't heard before, something warm and immediate, recognizing how each treatment contributes to recovery. He paused, then added softly, or how separate lives might align to create something new. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Sarah made her next move without really seeing it, more aware of Crawford's presence. Across the board than the game itself. When their hands briefly touched over a captured piece, the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her fingers. "The school's position is precarious," Crawford said after several moves, his tone shifting to practical matters, though his eyes held something more. "That storm proved it. But there's a solution, if you're willing to consider it." Sarah looked up, catching the interplay of firelight and shadow across his features. "I'm listening. My land includes a sheltered valley, less than a mile from here, good drainage protected from the worst winds." He gestured toward the maps they'd studied earlier. Elizabeth had chosen it for her hospital. The foundations were laid before, he trailed off, then continued more firmly. It could support a school as well, a proper one, built to withstand Montana winters. The suggestion took Sarah's breath for a moment. "You would do that?" "The land lies empty," Crawford said, his voice careful but intent. "Elizabeth's dream deserves life in whatever form it might take, and your students deserve safety." He moved his bishop, though Sarah noticed his hand trembled slightly. "You deserve safety." The game forgotten, Sarah studied the man across from her, this supposed recluse who spoke of building futures while his own past lay so clearly beneath the surface. "It's a generous offer, not entirely selfless," Crawford admitted, meeting her gaze. "These days with you, with the children, they've reminded me of something Elizabeth once said, that healing isn't just about mending bodies or minds. Sometimes it's about mending the spaces between people." Sarah felt the truth of it in her own heart, in the way solitude had begun to thaw like spring ice. Thomas believed teaching was similar, that every lesson was really about connection. Crawford's hand moved across the board, but instead of touching a chess piece, his fingers found hers. The contact was light, questioning, giving her every chance to withdraw. Sarah turned her palm upward, accepting the connection, feeling the strength and gentleness in his touch. "We could build something here," he said softly, "not to replace what we've lost, but to honor it, to create something new from the foundations our loved ones laid." The chess pieces stood witness as Sarah interlaced her fingers with his, feeling the calluses that spoke of work and purpose, the tremor that betrayed his vulnerability. Outside, the storm's voice had finally begun to fade, as if nature itself were holding its breath for her answer. "Yes," she said simply, watching peace settle across Crawford's features like fresh snow across familiar landscape. "I think we could." The morning brought clear skies and a transformed world. Snow lay deep across Crawford's land, but beneath its blanket, Sarah could see the promise he'd described. The sheltered valley caught the early light like a cup holding gold, its natural amphitheater offering protection from the worst of Montana's winds. Crawford stood beside her on his broad porch, a property deed in his gloved hands. "Elizabeth drew up the plans herself," he said, unfolding the carefully preserved document. "She saw it as a place of both learning and healing, a hospital with teaching rooms, gardens for medicinal herbs, quarters for students who might follow. In her path, the plans showed a woman's practical touch, southern exposure for the classrooms, covered walkways between buildings, even a bell tower that would carry sound across the valley. Sarah traced the careful lines, seeing how easily her schoolroom could fit into Elizabeth's larger vision. "She would have approved," Crawford said quietly, "of children learning here, Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. James Henderson, Catherine's father, led a small group from town, their faces a mixture of relief and curiosity as they took in the sight of Sarah and Crawford standing together. "Mrs. Winters," Henderson called, dismounting. "The storm finally let us through. We've been sick with worry." His eyes moved between them, noting their proximity, the shared document in their hands. "Mr. Crawford, we are grateful for your assistance." Crawford's posture had stiffened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Your children showed remarkable strength. You should be proud." "Yes, well," Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, uncertain how to address the territory's most reclusive landowner. "We've come to bring them home, and Mrs. Winters as well, of course." Sarah felt Crawford's tension beside her, saw how easily they could retreat to their separate solitudes. Instead, she stepped forward, still holding Elizabeth's plans. "Mr. Henderson, I'm glad you're here. There's something the town council should consider." Over the next hour, as Catherine and James reunited with their father, Sarah and Crawford presented Elizabeth's vision and their adaptation of it. The other riders, including 2 council members, gathered around the drawings spread on Crawford's broad table. A proper school would serve the whole valley, Sarah explained, watching understanding dawn in their faces. "Safe from storms, room, to grow as more families arrive." She met Crawford's eyes briefly. "And perhaps, in time, space for medical training as well." "You're offering the land?" Thomas Parker, the senior councilman, asked Crawford directly. "And resources for construction." Crawford's voice held the same quiet authority he'd shown during their rescue. "It's time this property served its intended purpose." The council members exchanged glances, heavy with meaning. Everyone knew the story of Crawford's withdrawal after his wife's death, how he'd abandoned Elizabeth's plans for community development. This change spoke of something significant. "And Mrs. Winters?" Henderson asked carefully. "You'd continue teaching here?" Sarah straightened, feeling Crawford's supportive presence beside her. "I would. The location is more central for many families, and the facilities Mr. Crawford proposes would allow us to expand our educational offerings." She didn't mention the growing warmth between them, the way their separate griefs had begun to transform into shared purpose, but she saw understanding in Mrs. Peterson's eyes as the older woman studied them. "Elizabeth Crawford chose this valley for good reasons," Mrs. Peterson said, her practical voice cutting through the men's hesitation. "And if our most experienced teacher and largest landowner want to collaborate for the community's benefit, I say we'd be fools to refuse." Her words broke the tension. Soon the council members were discussing logistics. Henderson was examining the proposed road access, and the plans were being studied with genuine interest rather than suspicion. Through it all, Sarah felt Crawford's steady presence, saw how each small sign of acceptance helped him engage more fully with the community he'd fled. When Catherine hugged him goodbye, his eyes held a brightness that made Sarah's heart turn over. "We'll present it formally at next week's council meeting," Parker said, as they prepared to leave. He looked between Sarah and Crawford with shrewd understanding, though I suspect this partnership has already been decided. After they'd ridden away, Crawford and Sarah stood again on the porch, watching fresh snow fall softly in the valley that would hold their shared future. "Partnership," Crawford mused, tasting the word. Elizabeth would have liked that term. "Thomas, too," Sarah said softly. "He always said the best foundations were built by people working together." Crawford's hand found hers, warm despite the winter air. "Shall we begin?" he asked, and in his voice Sarah heard all the questions and promises that single phrase contained. The newspaper clipping fell from between the pages of Elizabeth's medical journal, yellow with age, its edges worn soft with handling. Sarah caught it before it could flutter into the fire, and her heart stopped at the headline, "Fever Claims 20 in Mining Camp Tragedy." Crawford stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. "I wondered when you'd find that," he said quietly. "Elizabeth kept it as a reminder of why we came here. The article told a devastating story, a remote mining camp struck by typhoid, the nearest doctor 3 days' ride away. A young woman, Elizabeth, who tried to save them with her father's medical knowledge, and her new husband, James Crawford, who watched helplessly as she worked herself to exhaustion, trying to stem the deadly tide. "You were there," Sarah said softly, reading between the stark lines of newsprint. "This was what brought you to Montana," Elizabeth said. "We could do more good here, establish proper medical care before more settlements grew." Crawford moved to the window, his voice distant with memory. "We had the means. My railway investments had proved fortunate. She had the knowledge, the vision." He pressed his palm against the cold glass. What she didn't have was time. The weight of his words hung in the air. Sarah thought of Thomas, of how quickly influenza had taken him, how powerless she'd felt watching him slip away. The fever that took her, she ventured carefully, was it like Catherine's? Similar. Crawford turned, and Sarah saw the old pain etched in his features. Elizabeth had been treating a family out near Miller's Creek. 3 days of riding through, spring storms to reach them. By the time she returned, his voice caught. "I knew everything she'd taught me about healing, had all her father's books and medicines. But I couldn't save her." Sarah set the clipping aside and crossed to him, drawn by the raw hurt in his voice. "Is that why you stopped practicing medicine?" "Partly." He accepted her presence beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "But mostly because I couldn't bear to fail anyone else that way. Easier to close the gates, tend only to my own needs. Until the storm brought us to your door. Until then." His hand found hers, clutching it like an anchor. Watching Catherine fight that fever using Elizabeth's medicines, her methods, it was like her hand was guiding mine, like she'd been waiting for me to remember why we came here. Sarah understood suddenly why he'd been so certain in his care of Catherine, why his grief hadn't paralyzed him in that crucial moment. You couldn't save Elizabeth, but you could save another child. Using everything she taught you, yes. The word came out rough with emotion. But seeing you with the children, watching you teach despite your own loss, it showed me something else Elizabeth tried to tell me. That healing isn't just about medicines and procedures. It's about being present, about continuing the work, even when it hurts. Sarah thought of her own darkness after Thomas died, how the children's needs had drawn her back to life. "Teaching saved me," she admitted. "Having to be there each day, seeing them learn and grow. It gave me purpose when grief would have closed me away, like you've given me purpose again." Crawford's voice held a new note, something like wonder or awakening. "But Sarah, I need you to understand, Elizabeth will always be part of this place, of who I am, as Thomas will always be part of me and my work." She turned to face him fully. "They shaped us, James, taught us how to love, how to serve, how to endure. Asking us to forget them would be like asking us to forget ourselves." Something eased in Crawford's stance, a tension he'd perhaps been carrying since the storm forced him to act as healer again. His fingers tightened on hers. "When I saw you in the schoolhouse that night, fighting to protect those children, you reminded me of her, not in looks or manner, but in spirit, in the strength of your dedication. And you," Sarah said softly, "had Thomas's same instinct to help, to build something lasting for others." She touched the newspaper clipping gently. "Perhaps they led us to each other, knowing we could help heal not just others, but ourselves." Crawford's other hand came up to cup her cheek, and in his eyes Sarah saw past and future meeting, shadow and light merging into something new and beautiful and whole. Sarah discovered the first crocus pushing through the melting snow near Elizabeth's old herb garden. Its purple petals seemed almost impossibly brave against the lingering patches of white, a harbinger of warmth to come. She knelt beside it, remembering Thomas's delight in these early blooms. "Elizabeth planted those," Crawford said, coming up behind her, "said they were nature's promise that winter always ends." He carried surveying equipment, stakes and line for marking the school's foundation. The valley had begun to emerge from its winter shroud, revealing the gentle contours that had first caught Elizabeth's eye. "They're perfect here," Sarah said, watching him set down his burden. "Protected by the valley walls, just like she planned." The morning sun caught his face as he knelt beside her, and she saw how the months since the storm had softened something in his features, smoothed away some of the harsh loneliness. "The town council approved the final plans yesterday," he said, his voice warm with satisfaction. "We can break ground as soon as the frost leaves the earth." His hand found hers naturally now, their fingers twining with familiar comfort. "Though, I admit, I'll miss having you and the children here." They'd been holding classes in his library through the winter months, the space transformed by young voices and eager minds. Sarah had watched Crawford gradually drawn into the lessons, sharing his knowledge of science and medicine, his deep love of literature kindling similar sparks in his young students. "It won't be far," she reminded him, though she too felt a pang at the thought of leaving the home that had sheltered them through the darkest days. "And you'll be overseeing construction." "We both will." His thumb traced patterns on her palm. "Equal partners, remember?" The word carried echoes of their first chess game, of possibilities spoken in firelight. Sarah turned to study the valley, seeing not just Elizabeth's carefully planned medical center, but their own additions, the classroom wings, the living quarters, the gardens that would serve both healing and teaching. "I've been thinking," Crawford said carefully, "about what Elizabeth wrote in her journals about combining knowledge and purpose, about building something larger than ourselves." He helped her to her feet, keeping her hand in his. "The children need more than one teacher." Sarah felt her heart quicken, understanding his direction. "You've already been teaching them, James. I've seen how they respond to your lessons about the natural world, about the human body. It's given me purpose again," he admitted, watching. Their minds open to new ideas, seeing them connect one piece of knowledge to another. "It reminds me of teaching Elizabeth's medical students." Before, he paused, then continued more strongly. "I'd like to do more of it. Formally, if you're willing to share your classroom." The crocus bobbed in a gentle breeze, scattering droplets of melted snow. Sarah thought of how naturally they'd fallen into working together, how his presence had enriched her teaching, even as her students had helped heal his solitude. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." His smile transformed his whole face, reminding her of that first thaw she'd witnessed in him. "Then perhaps," he said, his voice holding that same careful hope she'd come to cherish, "we might consider sharing more than just a classroom." Sarah felt the weight of his meaning, saw it in his eyes as he turned to face her fully. Around them, the valley lay open to spring sun, Elizabeth's crocuses pushing through winter's last hold like hope made tangible. "Yes," she said simply, and watched joy dawn across his features like sunrise on new snow. When he drew her close, his kiss tasted of promise and possibility, of endings transformed into beginnings. Later, as they marked out the foundation lines together, Sarah thought she felt the blessing of those who had loved them first, Thomas's practical wisdom, Elizabeth's healing vision, merging with their own dreams for the future. The valley held them all, past and present, death and rebirth, winter yielding at last to spring. The drawing appeared on Crawford's desk one morning, a child's careful rendering of the valley's future school, complete with stick figures of two teachers standing hand in hand. Catherine Henderson's signature decorated the corner, alongside a carefully printed, "Thank you for teaching us about medicines." Crawford touched the paper gently, and Sarah watched emotion flicker across his face. "Elizabeth kept a collection of thank you notes," he said softly, "from families she'd helped. I never thought I'd receive one of my own." The past weeks had transformed Crawford's library into a true classroom. Children sprawled on thick carpets, reading from his collection of natural histories. Anatomical drawings from Elizabeth's medical texts hung alongside grammar charts, while dried herbs from her garden provided lessons in both science and healing. "You're a natural teacher," Sarah said, watching him prepare for the day's lessons. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he set up the microscope, Elizabeth's prized possession, that had captivated their students with views of an invisible world. "I had excellent examples," he replied, glancing at her with warmth. "Elizabeth taught me that healing requires patience and clear explanation. You've shown me how to make knowledge accessible to young minds." He straightened as voices approached outside. "And the children, they teach me something new every day." The class filed in, no longer intimidated by the grand house or its once reclusive owner. They brought with them the sounds and energy of youth, something Crawford's home had long forgotten. Sarah saw how he straightened, came alive in their presence. "Today," he announced, "we'll learn about the human heart." He caught Sarah's eye briefly, his own heart evident in his gaze, both its physical structure and its capacity for healing. The lesson unfolded like a flower opening to sun. Crawford guided small hands to feel their own heartbeats, explained how the muscle worked tirelessly to sustain life. Sarah added her own insights about emotional hearts, how they could break but also mend, how they could expand to hold new love alongside cherished memories. Mrs. Peterson, arriving early to collect. Her youngest paused in the doorway to watch. Her shrewd eyes took in the scene, Crawford demonstrating circulation using red and blue ribbons, students completely engaged, Sarah moving naturally alongside him to support their shared lesson. "You've done good here," the older woman said, quietly to Sarah as the children gathered their things. "Both of you, the whole town sees it." Sarah followed her gaze to where Crawford was carefully wrapping Elizabeth's microscope, his movements holding both reverence for the past and purpose for the future. "We're building something together," she said simply. "Yes, well." Mrs. Peterson's practical voice held approval. "About time both of you stopped rattling around alone in your grief. Elizabeth Crawford was the best healer this territory ever saw, and your Thomas built half the solid structures in town. They'd want their work carried on." The wisdom of this struck Sarah deeply. They weren't erasing the past, but building on its foundation, turning solitary grief into shared purpose. She saw it in the way Crawford had begun integrating Elizabeth's medical knowledge into their lessons, how he spoke her name now with gentle remembrance rather than raw pain. As the last student left, Crawford turned to Sarah. "I've been thinking about the new school's medical wing," he said. "What if we offered basic healing classes for older students? Elizabeth always said knowledge of the body's workings should be common wisdom, not locked away in doctors' offices." Thomas would say, "The same about building skills," Sarah agreed. He believed everyone should understand the structures that shelter them. She moved to help him organize Elizabeth's teaching materials. "We could offer both. A true community school." Crawford's hand brushed hers as they worked. Teaching. Not just reading and figures, but practical arts for frontier life. They stood together at the library window, watching their students head homeward through the spring sunshine. The valley below showed signs of construction, foundations beginning to emerge from thawing earth. Like the school itself, their relationship had grown naturally from shared purpose and understanding. "Catherine's drawing," Crawford said thoughtfully. "She saw us as equals, teaching together." "Children often see truth most clearly," Sarah replied, and felt his quiet laugh of agreement as he drew her closer. Sarah found her wedding ring from Thomas in a drawer while packing books for the move to the new school building. The simple gold band caught the summer light, bringing memories of another June day, another promise. She sat beside the half-filled crate, holding the ring as the morning heat built outside. Crawford found her there, his footsteps hesitating when he saw what she held. "Sarah." His voice held understanding and a question. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, watching sunlight play across the gold, "about promises kept and promises transformed." She looked up at him, seeing how he filled the doorway with his presence, how naturally he belonged in her life now. "Thomas and I promised till death do us part, and he kept that promise, though not in any way we'd imagined. Crawford moved to sit beside her, close enough to share warmth but not touching, giving her space to work through her thoughts. "Elizabeth and I promised the same," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if she knew somehow that her work would continue through others." Sarah opened her hand, letting the ring rest in her palm. "I've kept this close, like keeping him close. But lately," she paused, finding the right words. "Lately I've realized that honoring his memory doesn't mean holding myself apart from new joy." "No," Crawford agreed softly, "it doesn't." His own hands, capable and gentle, remained folded in his lap, but she felt the full force of his attention. "Elizabeth's father told me something similar after we lost her. Said that love doesn't divide when we share it, it multiplies." The morning heat pressed against the windows, filling the room with golden light. Outside, they could hear the sounds of construction from the valley, their new future taking shape, beam by beam. Sarah closed her fingers around Thomas's ring, feeling its familiar weight one last time. "I've been afraid," she admitted, "that moving forward meant leaving him behind. But working with you, seeing how Elizabeth's presence enriches rather than shadows what we're building." She turned to face Crawford fully. "I understand now that love doesn't end. It changes form, like water flowing into new channels." Crawford's eyes held depths of emotion that made her breath catch. Sarah, just her name, but it carried volumes of meaning. His hand moved to cover hers, warm and strong around her closed fist. "You've helped me understand that too, that opening our hearts doesn't dishonor what we've lost." The ring pressed between their palms like a heated coin. Sarah felt the last of her hesitation melting away in the summer warmth. "I'd like to do something," she said, "a gesture of respect for the past and hope for the future. Would you come with me?" They walked together to Elizabeth's herb garden, now flourishing in the summer sun. The medicinal plants she'd cultivated still grew there, tended now by both their hands. Sarah knelt beside the flowering herbs, breathing in their healing fragrances. "Thomas helped me plant my first garden," she said, using her free hand to dig a small hollow in the rich earth. "He said growing things was an act of faith in the future." She opened her palm, looking one last time at the ring that had symbolized their union. "I think he'd understand this." Crawford knelt beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Together, they buried the ring among Elizabeth's healing herbs, covering it with soil that held both their pasts and their future. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, but they were gentle tears, cleansing rather than grieving. "Elizabeth would say," Crawford murmured, drawing Sarah against him, "that the best healing comes from honoring pain while choosing joy." His lips found her temple, then her cheek, then finally her mouth in a kiss that tasted of summer herbs. And promise, when they parted, Sarah felt lighter, as if setting down a burden she hadn't fully recognized carrying. The garden around them hummed with bees, with growth, with life continuing its eternal cycle. Crawford's arms held her securely, and in his embrace she felt not the erasure of her past love, but its transformation into something new and equally sacred. "James," she said softly, using his given name with all the weight of choosing it, choosing him. His answer was to draw her closer, their shadows merging in the summer sun, while below in the valley the walls of their shared future rose, steadily against the Montana sky. The letter appeared on Sarah's desk one crisp October morning, Crawford's strong handwriting flowing across the cream-colored paper. She recognized it as Elizabeth's personal stationery, the kind she'd used for medical correspondence, and the significance of that choice made Sarah's heart flutter. "My dearest Sarah," it began, the formal phrase warming her with its sincerity. "As we stand at the threshold of our new school's completion, I find myself thinking of other thresholds, other beginnings. Elizabeth once wrote that the best decisions are those that honor both head and heart. My head tells me that what we've built together, this partnership of purpose and understanding, makes perfect sense. But my heart, Sarah, my heart sings with something far beyond sense." She had to pause, pressing her hand to her chest as if to contain the emotion there. Through the classroom window, she could see Crawford in the valley below, directing the placement of the school's bell, salvaged from her old schoolhouse and newly restored under his careful hands. "I've watched you this past year," the letter continued, "teaching our children with such grace and wisdom. I've seen how naturally you've woven Elizabeth's healing knowledge into your lessons, how you've helped me transform my solitude into service. You've shown me that love doesn't diminish when shared, but grows stronger, like sunlight reflected between mirrors, multiplying into infinity." The autumn wind stirred fallen leaves outside, their colors echo of the flames that had brought them. Together that winter night, Sarah read on, her vision blurring slightly. The town council meets today to review the final plans for the medical wing. They'll find everything in order, every detail considered and provided for. But there's one detail, dearest Sarah, that remains unresolved. One question that needs asking. A shadow fell across her desk. Crawford himself, standing in the doorway, with something held carefully in his hands. Sarah looked up from the letter to find his eyes, seeing in them all the love his words had expressed. "I thought," he said softly, "this should be returned to service." He opened his hands to reveal Elizabeth's ring, not her wedding band, which lay buried with her, but her engagement ring, a simple silver circle set with a small, perfect sapphire. Elizabeth believed that healing tools should be passed on to those who would use them with love and wisdom. "I believe this ring is such a tool, one that can help heal the past while building our future." Sarah stood, the letter trembling in her hands. "James, Sarah Winters," he said formally, though his voice held tender warmth, "you've taught me that love is not a finite resource to be hoarded, but a living force that grows when shared. Would you share your life with me? Help me transform this place of solitude into a true home for healing and learning." The question hung in the autumn air between them, weighted with all their shared history, all their future possibilities. Sarah thought of Thomas's ring, nurturing new growth in Elizabeth's garden. She thought of Crawford's patient hands tending, Catherine's fever of shared books and chess games, of two griefs becoming one joy. "Elizabeth's father," Crawford continued softly, "told me once that the greatest healing comes from choosing love, even after loss. I choose you, Sarah, not to replace what was lost, but to create something new and wonderful." Sarah stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "When Thomas died," she said carefully, "I thought I'd never find such certainty again. But you've shown me that certainty comes in many forms." She touched the ring in his palm, feeling its cool smoothness. "Yes, James, I choose you too." The ring slipped onto her finger, as naturally as if it had been waiting for this moment. Crawford's hands trembled slightly as they held hers, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same mixture of past and present, memory and hope, that she felt in her own heart. Beyond the window, the school bell rang suddenly. One of the workers testing. It's mounting. The clear tone carried across the valley like a benediction, like a promise. Crawford drew Sarah close, and in his embrace she felt the rightness of their choice, the perfect balance of honoring the past while embracing the future. "They would be proud," she whispered against his chest, "of what we've built here." "Yes," he agreed softly. "They would understand better than anyone how love multiplies when shared." A year to the day after the storm that had brought them together, Sarah opened a new locket, a gift from Crawford that morning. Inside, two portraits faced each other across its golden heart, Thomas on one side, Elizabeth on the other, their images sharing the space as naturally as their memories shared Sarah and Crawford's hearts. "For carrying forward," Crawford said, softly, helping her fasten it around her neck. Elizabeth would say remembrance and future hope belong together, like healing herbs in the same garden. They stood in the completed school's main hall, winter light streaming through tall windows Elizabeth had specified in her original plans. The medical wing gleamed with new equipment, while classrooms filled the other wing, exactly as they'd envisioned. Students' artwork decorated the walls, drawings of plants and their healing properties, anatomical sketches, scenes from literature they'd studied together. "It's perfect," Sarah said, touching the locket where it rested against her collar. "All of it." She looked up at Crawford, seeing how the year had transformed him. The darkness of grief had lifted from his features, replaced by quiet joy and purpose. Catherine Henderson burst in, her cheeks red with cold and excitement. "The decorations are ready, and Mrs. Peterson says the wedding arch is just like the one in the picture from Elizabeth's book of pressed flowers." Sarah smiled, remembering how they'd found the book while packing Crawford's library for the move, Elizabeth's collection of wedding flowers, each carefully preserved with notes about their meanings. They'd chosen their decorations from those pages, incorporating both Elizabeth's botanical knowledge and Thomas's carpentry in the arch design. And look! Catherine held up a new drawing, the school rendered in winter colors, with two figures standing beneath an arch while children scattered flower petals. "For your wedding present, Dad helped me get the building details right." Crawford knelt to examine the artwork, treating it with the same serious attention he gave to medical texts. "You've captured it perfectly," he said, "right down to the bell tower." The tower that now housed both Sarah's school bell and Elizabeth's old healing bell, their voices blending into one call across the valley. The door opened again, bringing a swirl of snow and Mrs. Peterson. "The storm's picking up," she announced, "but nothing like last year's, thank heaven. Still, we should finish the preparations before it gets worse." Sarah and Crawford exchanged glances, remembering another storm, another moment of transition. "We've learned to respect Montana winters," Crawford said, helping Sarah with her shawl, the new one he'd knitted himself, following Thomas's pattern, but adding his own touches of design. They walked together through their creation, past the hospital rooms ready for future patients, past classrooms where children learned both letters and healing arts, past the library that combined Crawford's books with Sarah's teaching materials and Elizabeth's medical texts. Every space held their shared vision, their combined purpose. The wedding arch waited in the main hall, crafted from valley timber and decorated with dried flowers from Elizabeth's garden. Tomorrow it would witness their formal union, though in truth they'd been joined in purpose since that first night of rescue and healing. "I've been thinking," Crawford said as they checked the preparations, "about what Elizabeth used to say about patterns, how healing follows cycles like seasons." He touched Sarah's locket gently. "A year ago, winter brought us together. Tomorrow, it gives us a new beginning." Sarah leaned into his warmth, watching snow fall beyond the windows. "Thomas would say there's wisdom in that. He always found meaning in nature's timing." Catherine had followed them, still clutching her drawing. "Tell the story again," she pleaded, "about the night Mr. Crawford found you in the storm." Sarah smiled, remembering how this young girl's fever had been the catalyst for so much healing. "Well, it was a night much like tonight, though the storm was fiercer." As she began the tale, other children gathered, drawn by the familiar narrative. Crawford's arm settled around her shoulders, and Sarah felt the weight of the locket against her heart, past and present, memory and hope, all contained in one precious vessel. Through the windows, they could see the valley transformed by snow. But this time, the white expanse brought no fear. Their buildings stood solid against winter's fury, their bells ready to guide any wanderer home. In the medical wing, Elizabeth's medicines waited to heal. In the classrooms, Thomas's craftsmanship sheltered young minds. "And tomorrow," Crawford whispered for her ears alone, "we begin our own story." Sarah touched her locket, feeling the presence of those who had loved them first. "No," she corrected gently, "tomorrow we continue it." The school bell rang clear and true across the snow-covered valley, its voice mingling with Elizabeth's healing bell in a duet of celebration. Sarah stood before the mirror in what had once been Elizabeth's study, now her own classroom, touching the locket that held 4 loves, 2 past, 2 present, all eternal. Mrs. Peterson adjusted Sarah's shawl, the one Crawford had knitted, its pattern incorporating both Thomas's traditional designs and healing herbs from Elizabeth's garden. "There," the older woman said softly, "perfect as new snow." Through the window, Sarah watched their community gathering. The town council members who had first doubted Crawford's transformation, the parents who had trusted them with their children's futures, the students who had helped heal Crawford's solitude. Catherine Henderson led the younger children in scattering dried petals from Elizabeth's garden along the path to the wedding arch. Crawford waited there, strong and sure, no longer the recluse, but a man restored to purpose. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and Sarah remembered how he had appeared that desperate night, a shadow against the storm, bringing rescue and, though they hadn't known it then, redemption. Their vows, when spoken, carried the weight of experience, of love lost and found again. They had chosen words that honored all their paths, healing and teaching, grief and joy, solitude and communion. As Crawford's hands clasped hers beneath the arch he had built, using Thomas's tools, Sarah felt the presence of those who had shaped their journey. The school bells rang again as they kissed, their voices carrying across the valley that had witnessed their transformation. In the medical wing, Elizabeth's medicines waited to heal future hurts. In the classrooms, Thomas's craftsmanship would shelter generations of learning. Their legacies, like their loves, had multiplied rather than divided. "Look," Catherine whispered, as they turned to face their community. Through the softly falling snow, a pair of crocuses had pushed through beside the arch, Elizabeth's early bloomers, defying winter just as she had once predicted. Crawford's hand tightened on Sarah's, recognizing the sign. The bells tolled once more, and Sarah thought of cycles completed and renewed, winter bringing loss and love, spring promising rebirth, summer offering growth, autumn teaching wisdom. She and Crawford moved together into their future, carrying their past not as a burden, but as a blessing, their shared purpose stretching out before them like fresh snow waiting for new footprints. Behind them, the school stood as their monument to love's capacity for healing, for teaching, for transforming solitude into community. And above, the bells sang out across the valley, calling others home to learn, to heal, to begin again.